Greetings. Let's just look quickly at this macroeconomic graph. We have price level here, and this was explained in the videos of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, so I won't go that much into this. And then we have Q slash, you can call it also Y, total output, real GDP, in other words, of the economy on the horizontal axis. Now, let's say we have aggregate demand curve, AD, like this, okay? And then we have a long run aggregate supply, okay, like this. So I'll just quickly talk about these two curves like this. Long run aggregate supply points at a particular point of our real output, of the output that the economy makes, at its natural state, what it is able to do and sustain in the long term. Okay, that means full employment, but not overemployment, employing all the people who are able to, in the long term, sustain being employed. So this point is the natural level of employment slash the natural level of real output. This is vertical, that means for price it doesn't change, but it just points at this very one point on the Q axis, because the Q, again, is about the real output, it's about the output of the economy. Basically, why it's horizontal, it doesn't care about the points on the P. It sums up all different points on the P, but it only points at one particular point on the Q, and it tells us what exact location, what exact, let's say, size the real output can be sustained as in the long term for a country. There's a certain amount of employees, and in the long term, this is the real output that they can bring. This is the full employment, not overemployment, not employing people who would not otherwise not be employed for a longer time than a short run one, but like the very long-term employment possibility is right here, and that brings the long-term aggregate supply. Okay, so this is long-term aggregate supply, and when our aggregate demand crosses this vertical line that tells us the long-term economic power of a country, this brings the long-run equilibrium. Okay, so long-run equilibrium, we can say LRE, long-run equilibrium. Now, this is the equilibrium with aggregate demand. It can be sustained because there's big enough supply, and the aggregate demand crosses it. It just crosses it like this. Now, very often the economy at times is not located necessarily at this equilibrium. There's this thing that we are talking now about in this exact video, and it's called the recessionary gap. Okay, the recessionary gap, and it's the situation when the supply is not used to its fullest. The supply that the nation can make, the employment, is not used to its fullest. There is unemployment. So it's a situation, it can be caused by a various amount of reasons, but what I'm talking about here is just the technicalities and the graph and how it's represented. I'm not necessarily bringing the concrete reasons that might stand behind this phenomena, but I'm talking about the phenomena as a thing that happens, that can be compared because it has a different equilibrium than this long-run equilibrium with the aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply is, and why it will soon or in a few years come back to the natural employment level, to the long-run equilibrium again. So let's say we have this curve. I'll call it short-run aggregate supply. Let's say right now, for these 3 years, a certain imagined country is right here, because short-run aggregate supply is aggregate supply that only happens in the short run. Why do we have two aggregate supplies? Is because this one talks about the static long-term ability, full employment state of the country. Okay, so what it is able to sustain in the long term. This one, in contrary, just talks about shorter time period, and it is sloping. It is sloping, so it by nature intersects this AD at a different point than the LRAS did. So it intersects it right here. And now if we cast down, if we just project down this point, we get, let's say, this was the Q of the long-term equilibrium, so LE, and this is short equilibrium, SE, let's say, okay? And right here, this will be the P, the price at the short equilibrium again, and the price at the long equilibrium. Now, this is a situation when we have a lower total output, the real GDP is lower in the short run situation than it is and can be sustained in the long run. This happens, and the gap in the GDP, the gap between the long run sustainable GDP, real GDP, and this particular concrete current lower than possible GDP is pointed out and lined out, and is called recessionary gap. Okay, I'll just say RG, recessionary gap. That's the name that is given to it. It happens during a recession, which is a periodical cycle in economies. From a macroeconomic perspective, it's a very important principle, it's a very basic principle, and it happens on a regular basis. So what this tells us is basically right now, with the short-run aggregate supply, that talks about supply right now, not necessarily in the long term, what the possibility is, but what just happens. Right now, let's say now in the some period of unit years, let's say 2 years, 1 year, can be 1 to 5 years in the short run. It depends. This is it. Okay, that means price levels are higher. Price levels are higher than what the natural employment with AD equilibrium shows us, the LRAS and the AD equilibrium shows us, and yet the GDP is lower. So both values are negative. Price levels are higher and GDP is lower. It can be repaired in two different ways. The way how this gets repaired is the short-run aggregate supply gets moved either to the right, that means this SRAS, I will call this one, and this is, let's say, RAS2. It never really moves all the way there. Just for illustrational purposes right now, we could have just drawn it like this, okay? So it would get closer to the good scenario, and we would say, well, it improved, or it might, but in this case, for illustrational purposes, I drew it all the way over it, so I basically said it's repaired now. That the SRAS moved to here means it got back. The equilibrium got back to the long run equilibrium again. So now it's intersected like this. That's when this SRAS moves right here. Okay, this can, for example, happen when the wages go down. Okay, when the wages go down for workers from the business perspectives, it means they have lower expenditures on labor, and they can hire more people for the same money. Therefore, real output will increase and things will improve. Things will get to the natural state. Means no longer underemployment is happening. Here there was underemployment. Less people than possible were employed. You can ignore all the other things and ideas that are derivable from this image, and you can just look at the horizontal level. And you see at this level, no matter what you find else about it, you see that simply real output was lower. Below the natural employment, that means there was unemployment compared to natural employment. And when we move right, doesn't matter how we do it, in the second I will choose and show the other way that it can be moved back to the same GDP level, but not to the same price level. In the price level will further rise. But we knew that the GDP was lower, and now it is at the natural rate. So there was unemployment, no matter what other causes this might have been brought by. So this is one solution. Or another solution is probably policy by the government. This is usually done with the policy of the government. And what this basically means is demand is raised. So let's say aggregate demand goes from 1 to 2. Well, what this means is we go back to the same GDP, but at the cost of price level rising. Okay? So that means, let's say people were not employed. So to make them all employed, suddenly they were given more money, or companies were given more money to give them more money, or something like that. There's so many different options you can imagine. So let's say it was some policy from the government. Now everybody has more money, and people might have been in the short term motivated to go more to work, so employment got to the natural employment level. But at the same time, when everybody suddenly has more money, all the money, there's more money, and the price level rises. There's inflation. So with these policies, let's say the aggregate demand, when the aggregate demand is forcefully pushed to the right, well, that causes inflation, because by the law of this graph, when you move the aggregate demand to the right, well, it rises the output, but it also rises the price levels. So this is the second option, how it can be moved to the same real GDP, but not necessarily to the same price level. To move to the same one, well, aggregate supply is the best thing to move. And there's many theories and information about how this can be moved, how it moves, what the natural patterns are, what the intended patterns are, what the governments do about this, and so on. But this one was meant to, in the first place, show you how this happens and how it is illustrated by this graph with short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and the combination of all. And the most important thing of all was the illustration and introduction of recessionary graph.